Deep in the bayous of Louisiana, where moss-draped cypress trees rise from stagnant waters and fog hangs heavy over the swamp. By day, they seem solemn and peaceful, their steeples reaching toward the sky and their doors hanging quietly in the wind. By night, the air shifts. Shadows gather along the walkways. Lanterns flicker with no hand to hold them. And whispers rise from the pews, carried on the thick, humid air. Visitors report seeing pale figures pacing the aisles. Ghostly hands reaching from the pulpit. Shadows moving among the tombstones outside. Some swear the swamp itself remembers every prayer, every tragedy, and every soul that wandered too close. And a few who remain too long say the churches themselves seem alive, groaning beneath the weight of memory. Their foundations echoing with voices from the past. Tonight, my dear friend, we will step into these haunted swamp churches. We will walk through fog-laden aisles, peer into abandoned sanctuaries, and listen to whispers carried across the water. And uncover the most haunted swamp churches in Louisiana, where every pew holds a story, and the spirits refuse to rest. So tell me. If you were standing alone inside a swamp church at midnight, and a pale figure appeared at the pulpit, staring silently, would you approach to see who it is? Or would you flee toward the safety of the swamp path before the shadows reach you? Hello, my dear friend. I am so glad you are here tonight, safe and warm, because the churches we are about to explore are not for the faint of heart. Louisiana's swamps are vast, dense, and teeming with life, but hidden among the cypress trees are churches abandoned for decades, some for centuries. Some were left after tragedy struck the congregation. Some fell to disease, storms, or unexplained accidents. Some simply crumbled, leaving wooden pews, broken stained glass, and foundations rising like skeletons from the swamp water. Visitors have reported strange phenomena. They hear footsteps along the aisles where no one walks. Figures appear in the shadows, dressed in clothing from long ago. Lanterns swing gently with no hand to hold them. Some have felt cold hands brush their arms or shoulders. The fog in these swamps is thick at night, masking edges and hiding shapes. Some have seen lights hovering above graves, flickering without cause. Others report hearing footsteps on rotting floors where no one stands. And many swear that the swamp itself seems to breathe, carrying voices from the churches and cemeteries alike. Before we walk these haunted swamp churches together, my friend, I want to ask you something. And I hope you will answer it in the comments. If you were standing alone inside a swamp church at midnight, and you heard your name whispered from the pulpit, would you step closer to see who is calling? Or would you leave immediately, hoping the Spirit allows you to go? Take a deep breath. Steady your heartbeat. And let us explore the most haunted swamp churches in Louisiana. Blackwater Church stands at the edge of a forgotten settlement, its silhouette rising unevenly against the sky. Its structure is old and visibly worn, built from dark stone and timber that have endured decades of neglect. By day, the church appears abandoned and decaying, its roof partially collapsed and its windows empty, allowing light to pass through without resistance. The grounds around the church are overgrown. Tall grass pushes up against cracked steps. And vines creep along the outer walls, gripping stone that has not been maintained in years. The front doors hang slightly open, their hinges rusted and stiff. Inside, the air is cool and heavy, carrying the scent of damp wood and dust. During daylight hours, the interior feels hollow. Rows of pews sit unevenly on warped flooring, some tipped or broken, others still aligned as if waiting. The central aisle stretches from the entrance to the altar, its surface worn smooth by countless footsteps long ago. Sunlight filters in through gaps in the roof, illuminating floating dust and fractured beams. Nothing moves inside the church by day. The silence feels complete, interrupted only by the occasional creak of settling wood. Or the distant sound of wind outside. Visitors often describe the space as empty but expectant, as if something has been paused rather than removed. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to shift. Light fades unevenly through the broken windows, leaving pockets of shadow along the walls and between pews. The air cools further. And sound behaves differently, carrying farther and lingering longer within the stone interior. Night arrives slowly at Blackwater Church. Darkness settles into the corners first, then spreads across the floor and up the walls. Moonlight enters through the open roof and shattered windows, casting pale shapes across the aisle. The church feels larger after dark, its boundaries less defined. It is within the aisles that figures are most often reported. They appear quietly, standing between the pews or moving slowly down the central path. Their forms resemble people, upright and measured, but lacking detail. Faces cannot be seen. Clothing cannot be distinguished. They exist as silhouettes shaped by darkness and faint light. These figures do not rush or wander aimlessly. Some pause near the altar. Others stop midway down the aisle, standing still as if listening. Looking away and back again may reveal them farther along the aisle, continuing their slow movement without interruption. The figures do not interact with one another. They pass quietly, maintaining distance, never colliding or acknowledging presence. Their movement feels routine, shaped by repetition rather than awareness of observation. Lantern light is another recurring feature of Blackwater Church at night. Visitors report seeing soft flickers of light near the altar, along the walls, or between pews. The glow sways gently, as though carried by an unseen hand. These lanterns do not illuminate the space fully. Instead, they cast small pools of warm light that reveal fragments of the interior before dimming again. The light produces no heat and casts weak shadows that fade quickly. When approached, the lanterns reveal no source. There is no metal frame, no flame, no person holding them. The glow simply exists, then disappears, often reappearing moments later in a different part of the church. At times, multiple lanterns flicker at once, spaced evenly along the aisle. The effect creates the impression of a quiet procession, moving slowly through the space without sound. Sound within the church remains minimal during these moments. Footsteps are rarely heard, and voices are absent. The silence feels intentional, as if the space itself is holding it in place. Historical records suggest Blackwater Church once served as the center of the surrounding community. Services were held regularly, often at night, guided by lantern light when electricity was unavailable. The aisles were walked countless times, and the interior echoed with movement and gathering. As the settlement declined, attendance dwindled. Eventually, the church was closed, its doors left open rather than sealed. Nature slowly reclaimed the structure, but the interior layout remained intact, preserved by habit and design. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects this history of routine. The figures move as congregants once did. The lantern light echoes guidance provided during evening services. The church appears to repeat patterns shaped by long use. Visitors often describe the experience as solemn rather than frightening. The figures do not approach. The lanterns do not guide outward. Everything unfolds with restraint, as if governed by an internal order that does not require explanation. Time can feel altered inside the church at night. Silence stretches longer than expected. Moments of movement pass quickly. Repetition of light and shadow creates a rhythm that draws focus inward, making it easy to lose track of duration. Attempts to document the activity rarely succeed. Photographs capture empty aisles and broken pews. Video footage shows only shifting light from outside. Audio recordings pick up wind and settling wood. But the lantern flicker often leaves no trace. Those who remain for extended periods report a strong sense of presence. Not a feeling of being watched, but of sharing the space with something ongoing. The church feels occupied by memory rather than people. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Figures appear less frequently and linger for shorter periods. Lantern light flickers briefly, then fades entirely. The interior settles back into stillness. By the hours before dawn, Blackwater Church is nearly silent. Moonlight softens, and the structure begins to reveal its shape again. The aisles lie empty. The pews stand undisturbed. At sunrise, the church looks unchanged. Daylight reveals decay, broken beams, and fallen stone. No sign remains of figures or lantern light. The silence returns to its daytime state, quiet and complete. Officials describe Blackwater Church as structurally unstable and advise against entering due to collapse risk. There are no warnings posted about sightings or lights, only notices regarding safety and preservation. Those who have witnessed the church at night often carry lasting impressions. The image of figures standing quietly in the aisles. The soft flicker of lantern light without a source. The sense that the church becomes active not with life, but with routine. Blackwater Church does not feel hostile or inviting. It feels attentive, shaped by repetition and memory. By day, it stands abandoned and decaying. By night, it briefly remembers how it was once used. When morning comes, the church settles again into silence, holding its empty aisles and broken walls, waiting quietly for darkness to return and allow movement and light to pass through once more. Widow's Hollow Church stands at the edge of a low-lying swamp where fog gathers thick and persistent, clinging to water and cypress roots long after sunrise. The structure is small and weathered, built of dark wood that has absorbed decades of moisture. Its steeple leans slightly, not from collapse, but from time, as if the ground beneath it has slowly shifted. The church takes its name from a minister who vanished decades ago. Records show he served the isolated community faithfully, walking the narrow boardwalks through the swamp to reach the church each morning. One evening, after locking the doors and extinguishing the lamps, he was never seen again. No trail was found. No sign of struggle. Only silence and unanswered questions remained. During the day, Widow's Hollow Church feels quiet and heavy. The swamp surrounds it on all sides, water reflecting dark trees and drifting mist. Inside, the space is simple. Rows of wooden pews face a modest pulpit. The floorboards are worn smooth where feet once passed repeatedly. Dust settles slowly in the filtered light that slips through narrow windows. Sound behaves oddly here, seeming to linger just a moment longer than expected. Fog presses close to the walls. It curls around the foundation and seeps through gaps beneath the doors, thinning the boundary between inside and outside. Light fades quickly, absorbed by fog and trees. The air cools, growing heavier, as if movement itself requires more effort. It is after dusk that figures appear. They pace slowly among the pews, emerging from shadow without sound. Their forms are human in outline but indistinct, shaped by dim light rather than detail. They move along the aisles with measured steps, turning at the ends of rows and continuing back the way they came. The figures do not sit. They do not kneel or gesture. Their movement is steady and deliberate, suggesting routine rather than confusion. They never approach the pulpit directly, instead circling the central space. As though bound to the paths between benches. When observed directly, the figures often fade. They thin into the darkness, blending with shadow and empty air. Moments later, another figure may appear farther down the aisle, continuing the same slow pacing without interruption. Witnesses describe a strong sense of familiarity. The movement feels practiced, as if repeated countless times. The figures do not convey urgency or distress. They appear focused, absorbed in the act of walking itself. Beyond the church walls, sound carries across the swamp. Soft cries drift through the fog, low and distant. The cries feel far away. They do not originate from a single point. Instead, they seem to move with the fog, circling the church and slipping between trees. At times, they feel closer, only to fade again into the vastness of the swamp. Inside the church, the cries are muffled. They press faintly against the walls, never entering fully, as if held outside by the structure itself. The effect is unsettling, creating the impression of separation between movement within and sound beyond. Researchers studying the area suggest environmental explanations. Fog can distort sound, bending it across water and vegetation. Swamps carry noise unpredictably, amplifying distant sources while masking nearby ones. Shadows inside the church may result from low light and uneven surfaces. Yet these explanations fail to address the patterns reported. The figures appear only at night. They follow the same aisles. The cries occur consistently during heavy fog. The experiences repeat regardless of season or weather. Visitors often report a sense of solemn reflection. Not fear, but weight. The pacing figures feel purposeful, as though continuing a task left unfinished. The cries feel sorrowful but restrained, expressing emotion without urgency. Some believe the church retains the imprint of devotion. Years of sermons, quiet prayer, and shared gatherings may have shaped the space itself. The pacing figures could represent routines embedded into the structure, replaying without awareness of time passing. Others believe the vanished minister remains central to the story. Not as a single presence, but as a moment of interruption. His disappearance left a ritual incomplete, a space unclosed. The repetition of movement may reflect a watch that never formally ended. Those who remain inside the church during the night often describe heightened awareness. Every creak of wood feels amplified. Breathing sounds louder. The space feels both empty and occupied, as though holding attention rather than releasing it. Despite the unsettling atmosphere, no harm has ever been reported. The figures do not approach observers. The cries do not escalate. The church does not act upon those who enter. The cries do not escalate. The church does not act upon those who enter. It allows observation, then withdraws into quiet. As night deepens, the activity gradually fades. The figures appear less frequently, dissolving more quickly into shadow. The cries grow softer, drifting farther into the swamp, until they disappear entirely. By early morning, Widow's Hollow Church returns to stillness. Fog thins and lifts. Light reveals empty pews and silent aisles. The swamp resumes its natural sounds. Nothing inside the church appears disturbed. Yet those who leave often carry a lingering impression. Not fear, but contemplation. The feeling that the space remembers what occurred within it. That repetition and silence can coexist, shaping places long after people depart. Widow's Hollow Church does not demand belief. It does not announce itself or seek attention. It stands quietly at the edge of the swamp, surrounded by water, fog, and time. When darkness falls and sound travels differently, it reveals subtle movement and distant voices. Among the pews, figures still seem to pace. Across the foggy swamp, soft cries still drift. And when daylight returns, the church releases its hold, standing silent once more, a weathered structure shaped by devotion, disappearance, and the quiet persistence of memory. Ashen Grove Church stands alone at the edge of a clearing where tall trees thin and the land slopes gently downward. The structure is old, its roof bowed slightly under years of storms, its wooden walls faded and scarred by wind, rain, and long exposure to the elements. Moss clings to the lower boards, and vines trace slow paths along the stone foundation. By day, the church appears quiet and empty, its windows dark and clouded with age. The doors hang straight but heavy, opening with effort and a low groan of wood against iron. Inside, the air is cool and still, carrying the scent of dust, old timber, and damp earth. Light enters through narrow windows, falling in pale bands across the floor. The silence here feels deliberate. As evening approaches, shadows gather early around the church. Trees block the last of the sunlight, and the interior dims long before night fully settles. The building seems to draw darkness inward, collecting it in corners, beneath pews, and along the far edges of the room. Visitors stepping inside often notice the temperature drop immediately. The air feels colder than outside, even in warmer seasons. Breath becomes visible in faint wisps that fade quickly. Sound behaves differently here, footsteps softening, voices seeming too loud and too small at the same time. It is in the shadowed corners that movement begins to appear. At first, the shapes are subtle. A darker patch where light should reach. A suggestion of form where two walls meet. As eyes adjust, the shapes resolve into figures standing quietly just beyond the brightest areas. They remain partially hidden, their outlines blurred by darkness and distance. These figures do not move abruptly. They do not approach. They stand still, as if waiting, positioned near pillars, doorways, or the far edges of the room. When watched directly, they thin and fade. When attention drifts, they return, occupying the same spaces with patient consistency. Visitors often feel the sensation before fully seeing the figures. Cold hands brush lightly against an arm. Fingers graze the wrist or forearm with brief, precise contact. The touch is unmistakable, cool enough to raise the skin, yet gentle and fleeting. It does not resemble a draft or fabric. It feels intentional, placed with care rather than force. Turning reveals no one nearby. Yet the chill from the contact lingers longer than expected, spreading faintly before fading. As people move deeper into Ashen Grove Church, the sensations repeat. Always brief. Always cold. The touches occur most often when passing near shadowed corners. Or moving between rows of pews where light barely reaches. Despite the unsettling nature of the experience, fear rarely takes hold. The atmosphere does not feel aggressive. The figures do not advance. The touches do not tighten or restrain. Everything feels controlled, restrained, as though guided by an unspoken understanding. Ashen Grove Church once served a small community that gathered here for decades. Records describe it as a place of quiet reflection, shelter from storms, and shared moments of stillness. As the surrounding settlement faded, attendance slowed. Eventually, the doors closed, and the church was left to weather time alone. Shapes lingering where people once stood in quiet thought. Touches echoing brief contact in narrow aisles and crowded gatherings. As night deepens, the figures become more noticeable. They appear in multiple corners at once, never interacting with one another, never stepping fully into the light. The sensation of cold hands becomes slightly more frequent near the center of the church. A brush along the elbow. A light touch at the shoulder. The contact remains careful, never startling, as if respecting boundaries that remain unspoken. Those who stop moving notice an immediate change. The touches fade. The figures seem to retreat deeper into shadow, becoming harder to distinguish from darkness itself. The room grows still, balanced, waiting. When movement resumes, the activity returns. Figures reappear where they were before. Cold brushes pass once more. The church feels attentive rather than reactive, acknowledging presence without interference. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited results. Photographs show empty corners and uneven light. Video footage captures shifting shadows that resist clear explanation. Audio recordings reveal only ambient creaks of wood and distant wind outside the walls. Environmental explanations suggest temperature differences, low light conditions, and the building's age contribute to unusual sensations. As the night reaches its quietest hours, the activity begins to lessen. The figures appear less often, dissolving more quickly into shadow. The sensation of cold hands stops without notice. The church settles into deep stillness, holding only darkness and silence. By early morning, Ashen Grove Church appears unchanged. Sunlight filters through the windows once more, illuminating empty pews and quiet corners. The air warms slightly. No figures remain. No sensation follows movement. The shapes watching from the corners. The feeling of sharing space with something present but unseen. Ashen Grove Church remains where it has always been, weathered by storms and time. By day, it offers quiet and shelter. By night, it becomes something else. When shadows deepen and silence settles, the church sometimes remembers its past, allowing figures to appear once more in its corners, and cold hands to brush lightly against passing arms, reminding visitors that some places never fully forget those who once gathered within their walls. Hollow Creek Church stands beside a narrow, swampy channel where dark water slips quietly through reeds and twisted roots. The building rests on slightly raised ground, just enough to keep its foundation dry while the land around it remains soft and saturated. By day, the church looks weathered but intact, its wooden walls grayed by moisture and time. The steeple rises modestly above the tree-line, often half veiled by drifting mist from the channel below. The creek moves slowly, carrying leaves, silt, and reflections that never quite settle. Inside, the church is simple. Wooden pews line a central aisle that leads to a small raised platform at the front. Windows are narrow and tall, allowing in muted light that shifts constantly as mist passes outside. Lantern hooks hang from beams along the ceiling, their metal dulled and worn. No electrical fixtures were ever added. The church relies entirely on natural light, and when the sun lowers, shadows arrive early. As evening approaches, Hollow Creek Church begins to change. The swamp outside grows quieter. Insects fall silent. The channel darkens, reflecting less of the sky and more of the surrounding trees. Inside the church, the air cools noticeably, and the smell of damp wood deepens. The last daylight fades unevenly, leaving long stretches of the interior in shadow. It is then that the shadows begin to move. They glide silently along the aisles, stretching between pews and across the worn floorboards. These shadows do not behave like ordinary ones. They move independently of light sources, sliding smoothly as though guided by an unseen current. Some pass straight down the center aisle. Others drift between the pews, their edges soft and deliberate. Visitors often notice the movement indirectly at first. A shift beside them. A dark shape where none should be. Turning to look directly usually reveals nothing unusual, only empty space and dim light. Yet when attention drifts again, the shadows resume their silent passage. As night settles fully, lanterns begin to swing. They move gently from the hooks along the ceiling beams, rocking back and forth in slow arcs. There is no wind inside the church. Doors remain closed. Windows do not rattle. Yet the lanterns sway as if stirred by something passing just beneath them. Some begin to glow softly, their light warm and steady despite the absence of flame. The swinging casts moving light across the walls and floor, causing shadows to stretch and overlap. Patterns form briefly, then dissolve, reshaping the interior into something unfamiliar. The lanterns never collide. Their motion remains measured, controlled, almost careful. Those who stand inside Hollow Creek Church at night often describe a strong sense of presence. Not threatening, not aggressive, but attentive. The feeling is strongest near the aisle, where shadows pass most frequently. It feels as though movement is being observed, acknowledged without reaction. The swamp outside seems to respond as well. Water in the channel grows quieter, its surface smoothing until reflections blur. Mist thickens and presses against the church walls, seeping through gaps and curling around the base of the structure. The building feels isolated, suspended between water and sky, cut off from the surrounding land. Historical records of Hollow Creek Church are incomplete. It was built generations ago to serve a small settlement that no longer exists. Floods reshaped the land over time, and families moved away one by one. The church remained, spared by slightly higher ground, its doors eventually closing when regular gatherings ceased. Local belief suggests the church never truly emptied. According to long-held stories, routine remained after people left. The building remembers movement. The aisle remembers footsteps. The lanterns remember evenings when light and shadow marked the passing of hours. The swamp, always present beside it, carries sound and memory slowly, releasing them when conditions are right. Visitors who stay after dark often experience subtle disorientation. Time stretches. Minutes feel longer beneath swinging lantern light that never changes. The interior seems larger than it should be, distances between pews subtly extended. Standing still often brings clarity, while moving too quickly increases unease. One visitor described standing near the back pew as shadows glided past along the aisle. Lanterns swayed overhead, their light revealing patterns that shifted with each swing. The visitor felt no fear, only the sense of being within a place that was aware of itself. When the visitor stepped outside, the shadows ceased immediately, and the lanterns slowed to stillness. Another account tells of a pair who entered the church just after sunset. As darkness settled, lanterns began to swing, and shadows moved steadily down the aisle toward the front. They felt compelled to remain quiet, as though sound would interrupt something already in motion. They left together without speaking. And neither heard movement once outside. Despite its unsettling qualities, Hollow Creek Church does not feel hostile. Nothing blocks exit. Nothing reaches out. The shadows do not touch. The lanterns do not fall. Everything unfolds slowly, deliberately, allowing visitors to observe rather than react. The shadows thin and blend into darkness. Lanterns slow their movement until they hang nearly still. Mist presses against the windows, dulling the outside world entirely. The church feels enclosed, protected by its own stillness. By dawn, Hollow Creek Church returns to quiet. Lanterns hang motionless. Shadows settle into fixed shapes along walls and pews. The swamp resumes its soft movement, insects returning cautiously to the air. Morning light filters through the narrow windows, revealing an interior unchanged by the night. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. The church appears peaceful, even fragile, its presence softened by time and weather. Only those who have stood inside after dark remember the moving shadows, the swinging lanterns, and the way the swamp seemed to listen. Hollow Creek Church exists between land and water, memory and stillness. Built beside a swampy channel, it reveals itself only when light fades and sound recedes. Shadows glide silently along its aisles. Lanterns swing with no visible source. It does not warn. It does not demand attention. It simply waits for night to return, holding its quiet vigil beside the dark water, remembering every step ever taken down its aisle, and releasing those memories slowly into the shifting air. Bloodstone Chapel stands on a low rise of dark earth, its stone walls stained by time and weather. The building is modest in size, constructed from heavy blocks that carry a faint reddish tone in certain light. By day, the chapel appears quiet and solemn, its roof partially repaired, its windows clouded with age. Nothing about the structure suggests urgency, yet it holds an unmistakable weight. The chapel once served a small surrounding community, acting as a gathering place during difficult years. Its interior is simple. Wooden pews line the narrow nave, their surfaces worn smooth by generations of hands and movement. The floorboards creak softly underfoot, and the air remains cool even in warm seasons. Historical records confirm that a tragic fire occurred here long ago. The blaze spread rapidly during an evening service, filling the chapel with smoke before help could arrive. The damage was extensive, and although the structure was later stabilized, regular use never fully returned. Over time, Bloodstone Chapel was left largely untouched, preserved more by neglect than intention. During daylight hours, the interior feels still. Sunlight filters through the aging windows, illuminating dust that drifts slowly through the air. The pews remain neatly aligned, though some are scorched or darkened from the fire. The altar stands intact, simple and unadorned, bearing quiet marks of heat long cooled. Nothing moves during the day. Sound is minimal, limited to the occasional settling of wood or distant wind outside. Visitors often describe a sense of restraint, as if the space is holding something back rather than revealing it. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to change. Light fades unevenly across the chapel, leaving shadows between pews and along the walls. The air grows heavier, and sound carries farther than expected. Even small movements seem amplified within the stone enclosure. Night settles slowly over Bloodstone Chapel. Moonlight enters through the windows and roof gaps, casting pale shapes across the floor. The pews form long, dark rows, their outlines blending together. The chapel feels larger after dark, its boundaries harder to define. It is within the pews that figures are most often reported. Visitors describe shapes rising slowly from the seated rows, emerging upright as if standing after long stillness. These figures appear human in outline, their forms assembling gradually in the dim light. They do not climb or step forward. Instead, they rise in place, lifting to a standing position without sound. Their movement is controlled and deliberate, lacking any sudden motion. No faces can be clearly seen. The figures lack detail, their presence defined by posture rather than features. They do not turn or gesture. They simply stand, occupying the space where people once sat. When attention is focused directly on them, the figures often fade slowly, dissolving back into the shadows between the pews. Looking away and back again may reveal them rising once more in a different row, repeating the same restrained motion. Alongside these appearances, visitors report hearing faint whispers. The sound is soft and close, forming near the listener rather than traveling across the room. It does not echo like ordinary speech. Instead, it feels contained, as though emerging from the walls or floor. Visitors report hearing their own names, pronounced accurately, even when they are alone and have shared no information. The tone carries no urgency or emotion. The whispers are never loud. They remain just above silence, requiring attention to hear. When ignored, they often fade gradually. When acknowledged, they may repeat, lingering longer than expected. Those who respond to the whispers frequently describe an intensification of the experience. The figures rise more frequently. For this reason, experienced visitors advise remaining silent and leaving once whispers begin. Historical context offers partial insight. During the fire, voices were reportedly heard calling out within the chapel, names spoken repeatedly as people tried to locate one another through smoke and confusion. These accounts were recorded but never fully explained. Some believe the whispers echo those moments, repeating fragments of sound tied to urgency and recognition. Others suggest the chapel absorbed these voices, releasing them under specific conditions when the space grows quiet enough. The fire left physical marks that remain visible. Darkened beams. Scorched pew edges. Stone discolored by heat. These details contribute to the feeling that the past has not fully settled, that the structure remembers more than it reveals. The whispers feel directed, intentional, as though the chapel is aware of who stands within it. This awareness does not feel threatening, but it is deeply unsettling. This awareness does not feel threatening, but it is deeply unsettling. The awareness does not feel threatening, but it is deeply unsettling. The whispers feel directed, intentional, as though the chapel is aware of who stands within it. This awareness does not feel threatening, but it is deeply unsettling. Visitors often describe a sensation of being recognized rather than watched. The whispers feel directed, intentional, as though the chapel is aware of who stands within it. The fire left physical marks that remain visible. Sound behaves unusually inside the chapel at night. Small noises seem to vanish, while whispers feel amplified despite their softness. The acoustics create a sense of proximity, making it difficult to judge distance or source. Attempts to document the activity rarely succeed. Photographs capture empty pews and still air. Audio recordings pick up wind or structural noise, but whispers often fail to register clearly. The experiences seem bound to presence rather than evidence. Time perception can shift while inside Bloodstone Chapel at night. Moments stretch longer than expected. Silence feels heavier. The repetition of rising figures and faint whispers creates a slow rhythm that draws focus inward. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Figures rise less often and fade more quickly. The whispers grow softer and more spaced apart. The chapel begins to settle, returning toward stillness. The moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The pews lie empty once more, undisturbed. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. By the hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. By the hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. The moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. By the hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. The moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. The air feels lighter, though the sense of weight lingers. The hours before dawn, the interior is nearly quiet. Moonlight softens. Shadows retreat. At sunrise, Bloodstone Chapel looks unchanged. Daylight reveals the same worn stone and darkened wood. No sign remains of figures or sound from the night before. The space returns to its daytime calm. There are no warnings posted about figures or whispers, only notices regarding structural safety and respect for the location. Those who have experienced the chapel at night often carry lasting impressions. The image of figures rising silently from the pews. The unmistakable clarity of hearing their own names spoken softly. The feeling that the chapel remembers voices and knows how to use them. Bloodstone Chapel does not present itself as hostile or inviting. It feels preserved in a moment that never fully ended. When darkness falls, fragments of that moment surface quietly, allowing movement and sound to return without explanation. By day, the chapel stands silent and solemn. By night, it listens, releases, and then settles again. The pews wait. The stone holds memory. And the whispers remain just faint enough to be heard only by those who stand still long enough to listen. Ironclad Church stands at the edge of an old industrial district where stone streets give way to quiet grass and scattered trees. The building is heavy and angular, constructed with thick masonry reinforced by iron beams that frame its doors, windows, and interior supports. Time has darkened the metal to a deep matte gray, streaked with rust where rain and air have worked slowly for decades. The church was built to endure. Its iron fixtures were installed for strength and longevity. Light filters through narrow windows, casting pale bands across stone floors and wooden pews. The air inside is cool and still, carrying the faint scent of dust and aged metal. Every sound seems amplified, then abruptly swallowed, as if the walls decide what may linger. The iron fixtures respond to the slightest change. As temperatures shift, the metal creaks softly, producing low, drawn-out sounds that echo through the sanctuary. A railing may groan without being touched. A hanging lamp may sway just enough to whisper against its chain. These noises are slow and deliberate, never sharp. As evening approaches, the atmosphere shifts. The church feels heavier, quieter, as though settling into itself. It is after nightfall that movement begins. Figures appear within the sanctuary, pacing silently along the central aisle and between the rows of benches. Their forms are human in outline but indistinct, shaped by shadow rather than light. They move steadily, never rushing, never stopping abruptly. They walk the same paths repeatedly, turning at the altar, then retracing their steps toward the rear of the church. Their motion feels practiced, as if following routes long established by habit rather than choice. When observed directly, the figures often fade. They thin into the darkness, dissolving into empty space between pews or along the walls. Moments later, another shape may appear farther along the aisle, continuing the same silent pacing without interruption. Witnesses often describe the movement as orderly. There is no sense of confusion or distress. The figures appear focused, intent on their path. They do not interact with one another, and they do not acknowledge observers within the sanctuary. Alongside the visual sightings come the sounds. Footsteps echo behind visitors as they move through the church. The sound is clear and unmistakable, matching the rhythm of human walking. Turning reveals nothing. The pews are still. Yet the silence that follows feels deeper than before. These footsteps behave differently from ordinary echoes. They follow turns. They slow when visitors slow. They stop when visitors stop. The sound responds as though tied to movement rather than environment. Researchers studying the building point to acoustic factors. Iron and stone create complex sound reflections. Temperature changes can cause metal to shift, producing rhythmic noise. Footfalls from outside or distant activity may travel through the structure. These explanations account for isolated sounds, but not the consistent sensation of being followed. Visitors often report a physical response. A tightening of awareness. A sense of proximity. The feeling that space behind them is occupied, even when sight confirms it is not. The sensation fades when leaving the sanctuary, only to return when stepping back inside. Despite the unsettling nature of the experience, fear is uncommon. Most describe alertness rather than panic. The figures do not approach aggressively. The footsteps do not chase. The church feels active, not hostile, as though movement continues without intent to disturb. Some believe the iron plays a central role. Metal retains vibration and responds slowly to environmental change. Years of movement, gatherings, and repeated foot traffic may have left patterns embedded into the structure itself. Under certain conditions, these patterns may resurface as sound and motion. Others believe the repetition of worship shaped the space. Walking aisles, pacing during preparation, and steady movement throughout services may have impressed a rhythm into the building. The figures may represent that rhythm continuing, detached from time and purpose. Those who remain in ironclad church late into the night often describe heightened perception. Every creak of metal feels intentional. Every echo feels closer. Time seems to stretch, measured by intervals of sound and silence rather than minutes. As the night deepens, activity gradually diminishes. The figures appear less frequently, fading more quickly into shadow. The footsteps grow softer and less persistent, eventually blending into the low ambient creaks of iron settling. By morning, the church returns to stillness. Sunlight reveals empty aisles and silent pews. The iron fixtures hang motionless. No trace of the night's movement remains. The sanctuary appears as it always has, quiet and undisturbed. Yet those who leave often carry a lingering impression. Not fear, but reflection. The sense that the building remembers how it was used. That repetition and structure can leave echoes long after people depart. Ironclad church does not announce itself. It does not warn or threaten. It stands firm, shaped by iron, stone, and years of routine. When darkness falls and sound behaves differently, it reveals subtle movement and echoing steps. Within its sanctuary, figures still seem to pace. Footsteps still follow just behind. And when daylight returns, the church releases its hold, standing silent once more, a structure that continues to carry the memory of motion within its walls, quietly repeating what once defined it. Mistvale Church stands at the edge of a small clearing where the ground dips and collects moisture from the surrounding hills. By day, the building looks quiet and reserved, its stone walls darkened by age and weather. Narrow windows line the sanctuary, their glass clouded and uneven, allowing light inside but never fully revealing the interior from outside. As night approaches, fog begins to gather in the low ground around the church. It moves slowly at first, drifting through grass and along the foundation. Then rising higher as the air cools. By the time darkness settles, the fog presses against the walls and windows, wrapping the structure in a pale, shifting veil. The world beyond the clearing fades, leaving the church isolated within mist and silence. Inside, the air grows noticeably colder. Wooden floors hold the chill, and the stone walls seem to draw warmth away. Sound behaves differently here at night. Footsteps soften. Even breathing feels subdued, as though the fog dampens everything it touches. Fog begins to roll through the windows without resistance. It seeps through cracks and openings, curling inward in slow, deliberate movements. The mist spreads across the floor, slipping between pews and pooling near the altar. It never rushes. It settles, as if the sanctuary is meant to contain it. As visibility lowers, shapes begin to form in the corners of the room. At first, they appear as darker patches within the mist, areas where the fog seems thicker and less willing to drift. Over time, these patches take on subtle structure, rising into upright forms that suggest human presence. They remain still, positioned where walls meet and light rarely reaches. These figures do not step forward. They do not gesture or turn. When watched directly, they seem to fade slightly. When attention drifts, they become clearer once more. The sanctuary feels occupied, though nothing stands fully in the open. Then the pale eyes appear. Within the fog and shadow, faint points of light begin to glow. They appear in pairs most often, positioned where faces might be within the corner figures. The glow is soft and steady, never bright enough to illuminate surroundings. They do not move quickly. They do not blink. They watch without urgency, holding position even as fog drifts between them and the room. When mist thickens, the glow dims. When it thins, the eyes return with quiet consistency. Despite the intensity of the sight, panic rarely sets in. The atmosphere does not feel aggressive. The figures do not advance. The eyes do not flare or narrow. Everything remains controlled, restrained, as though governed by an understanding that does not require words. Mistvale Church once served a small community that gathered here during all seasons. Records describe long evenings of quiet reflection, voices softened by stone and wood. Fog was common in this area, often surrounding the building during late services, pressing close to windows while warmth and light filled the interior. As the community thinned and gatherings ceased, the church was left to stand alone. The fog remained, returning night after night, slipping inside a space no longer filled with voices. Some believe the figures reflect that lingering presence. Shapes forming where people once stood. Eyes glowing where attention once focused forward in shared stillness. The sanctuary seems to remember being watched and watching in return. As visitors move carefully through the room, the fog responds. It curls closer around legs and pews, rising slightly before settling again. The figures remain in the corners, unchanged by movement. The pale eyes follow gently, never locking onto one place for long. Those who stop moving notice a shift. The fog settles lower. The figures seem to soften, blending more fully into shadow. The glowing eyes dim slightly, as if responding to stillness with restraint. The room feels balanced, waiting. When movement resumes, the activity returns. Fog drifts again through the sanctuary. The figures regain definition in the corners. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited results. Photographs capture fog-filled interiors and indistinct dark shapes. Video footage shows drifting mist and occasional points of light that fade before focus can be achieved. Audio recordings reveal only the subtle sounds of the building settling and distant wind outside. Environmental explanations suggest temperature differences and moisture create unusual visual effects. Low light and reflective surfaces may produce illusions. These explanations account for some elements, but not the consistency or placement of the glowing eyes. As night deepens, the fog reaches its thickest point. The sanctuary becomes a muted world of gray and shadow. The figures appear slightly closer together now, though still confined to corners. The eyes remain visible longer, holding their glow with quiet patience. Then, gradually, the process begins to ease. The fog thins, lifting slowly toward the windows. The figures lose definition, dissolving back into shadow and mist. The pale eyes dim and vanish one by one, leaving corners dark and empty once more. By early morning, Mistvale Church appears unchanged. Sunlight filters through the windows, revealing empty pews and a quiet altar. No fog remains inside. The air warms slightly. Nothing suggests the presence that filled the room hours before. Visitors leaving at dawn often pause outside, looking back at the church framed by thinning mist. In daylight, it appears peaceful and ordinary, a simple structure shaped by time and weather. Yet those who witnessed the sanctuary at night remember clearly. Fog rolling through windows as if invited. Figures standing silently in corners. Pale eyes glowing softly through the mist. Mistvale Church remains where it has always been, open to wind, fog, and time. By day, it offers stillness and shelter. By night, when mist rolls in and the world grows quiet, the church sometimes remembers its past. Fog drifts once more through its windows. Figures return to the corners. Pale eyes glow softly within the sanctuary, watching without judgment. Until morning comes and the veil lifts again. Shadowbank Church sits in a clearing carved from dense cypress forest. Its wooden walls pressed close by towering trunks and hanging moss. The trees grow so thick around the structure that daylight struggles to reach the ground, leaving the church in a constant state of dim calm. Even at noon, the air feels heavy and still, scented with damp bark and slow-moving water hidden among the roots. The church was built on slightly raised earth, its foundation just above the swampy soil that surrounds it. A short set of steps leads to the front entrance, worn smooth by years of use. The building itself is simple, with narrow windows and a steep roof designed to shed rain. No fence marks the boundary between forest and sanctuary. The cypress press inward, as if the church was placed among them rather than cleared from their path. During the day, Shadowbank Church appears quiet but uneasy. Light filters through the trees in scattered beams, shifting constantly as branches sway. The forest absorbs sound, muting footsteps and voices until everything feels distant. Visitors often remark on how close the trees seem, their trunks forming natural walls that guide movement toward the steps. As evening approaches, the forest changes. Cicadas fall silent. Birds retreat deeper into the canopy. The shadows beneath the cypress stretch longer, merging into broad pools of darkness around the church. The air cools quickly, and moisture settles on exposed wood and stone. The church feels less like a destination and more like a focal point, drawing attention without effort. It is at dusk that figures are first reported. They appear pacing the steps outside the entrance, moving slowly back and forth along the narrow platform. At first, they resemble visitors waiting quietly, hands folded, heads lowered. Only after watching for a moment does something feel wrong. Their movement is too steady. Their pace never changes. They do not acknowledge one another or the surrounding forest. Witnesses describe the figures as pale and indistinct, their outlines softened by low light and drifting mist. They do not climb the steps fully, nor do they descend. They remain bound to that narrow space, pacing as if following a routine long memorized. Looking directly at them causes their shapes to blur slightly, as though the eyes struggle to focus. When attention shifts away, the figures often vanish. No footsteps mark their departure. No movement is seen retreating into the trees. They simply are no longer there, leaving the steps empty and unchanged. Moments later, they may reappear, pacing once more as if nothing interrupted them. Those who approach the church at night often report an unsettling sensation. As they move closer, they feel a presence brushing past their shoulders, light and fleeting, like someone passing just behind them in a narrow hallway. Turning reveals no one there, only tree trunks and hanging moss swaying gently. The feeling repeats for many visitors, often near the steps or along the side walls of the church. It does not feel aggressive. There is no force or pressure. Instead, it feels incidental, as though sharing space rather than intruding upon it. The forest feels crowded despite the absence of visible movement. Inside the church, the atmosphere deepens. The interior is plain, with wooden pews arranged in neat rows and a central aisle leading to a modest front platform. The windows allow little light after sunset, and shadows gather quickly between the pews. The air is cool and carries the faint scent of old wood and damp earth. Visitors often feel the same brushing sensation inside, most frequently along the aisle. A light touch at the shoulder. A shift in air beside the neck. It never lingers long enough to provoke panic, yet it is persistent enough to command attention. Standing still often intensifies the awareness, while moving slowly seems to ease it. Outside, the figures continue pacing the steps. Through the windows, their movement can sometimes be seen as pale shapes passing in and out of view. They never enter the church. They remain outside, bound to the threshold, repeating their slow path beneath the cypress canopy. Local records of Shadowbank Church are sparse. It was built to serve a small riverside community that gradually dispersed as flooding and isolation made daily life difficult. Families moved away over decades rather than all at once. The church closed quietly, its final gathering unrecorded. The cypress grew thicker. Paths narrowed. The church remained standing, sheltered and enclosed. Stories began circulating about movement at dusk, about figures on the steps and the sensation of passing shoulders. No single event marked the change. It unfolded slowly, like the forest itself. Visitors who stay after dark often describe changes in perception. Time feels stretched. The church seems farther from the forest edge than it appeared earlier. Sound grows directional, footsteps echoing where no one walks. The brushing sensation becomes more frequent, though never stronger. It feels as though the space is being shared, not challenged. One visitor described standing at the base of the steps, watching a figure pace back and forth. As the figure passed, the visitor felt a light touch along the shoulder, like fabric brushing past. The figure faded moments later, and the sensation stopped. The visitor felt no fear, only the awareness of proximity. Another account tells of a small group who entered the church just before nightfall. As darkness settled, they felt movement beside them along the aisle, though no one else was visible. Outside, figures paced steadily on the steps, their silhouettes framed by cypress trunks. The group left quietly, feeling watched but not threatened. Despite its reputation, Shadowbank Church does not feel hostile. Nothing blocks entry or exit. Nothing escalates. The figures do not pursue, and the presence does not grow heavier. Everything remains measured, restrained, unfolding at its own pace. The experience feels observational rather than confrontational. As night deepens, mist often rises from the swampy ground, threading through the cypress and curling around the church. The figures become harder to distinguish, their pacing less visible through the haze. The brushing sensation softens, fading into the cool air. By morning, the church returns to stillness. The steps are empty. The forest resumes its quiet activity. Sunlight filters weakly through the cypress, illuminating dew on moss and wood. No sign remains of movement or presence from the night before. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. Shadowbank Church appears peaceful, almost hidden, a simple structure surrounded by trees. Only those who have been there at dusk remember the pacing figures, the light touch at the shoulder, and the feeling of sharing space with something unseen. It does not warn. It does not demand attention. It simply remains, holding its quiet routine beneath hanging moss and dark trunks, allowing the forest to breathe around it, while the church remembers every footstep that ever paused at its door. Dead Man's Hollow Church stands at the edge of a wide swamp where dark water pools between twisted trees and low-hanging fog rarely lifts. The structure was built on slightly raised ground, stone foundations holding it just above the wet earth, as if its builders knew the land would always be shifting beneath it. By day, the church appears abandoned and isolated, surrounded by reeds, slow water, and the quiet movement of insects. The outer walls are worn and uneven, stained by moisture carried in from the swamp. Moss clings to stone and wood alike, softening edges and dulling once sharp lines. This path once guided visitors around the church during gatherings, but now it lies mostly unused. Inside, the vestibules are small and bare. Light enters through narrow openings, filtered and muted, giving the interior a dim and enclosed feel even at midday. Sound does not travel far here. Everything feels absorbed by the walls and the surrounding land. During daylight hours, Dead Man's Hollow Church feels quiet but uneasy. The swamp beyond the walls is never truly silent. Water shifts. Branches creak. Distant splashes echo without clear source. Visitors often notice an uncomfortable awareness of the surrounding environment, as though the land itself is paying attention. As evening approaches, the atmosphere thickens. Fog drifts in from the swamp, settling low and clinging to the ground. The outer walkway darkens first, its edges blending into shadow. The church seems to pull inward, its presence more pronounced as the surrounding light fades. Night arrives slowly and completely. The church stands as a solid shape against the void, its windows dark, its doorways open but uninviting. The walkway around the building is barely visible, a thin line of wood suspended above black water. These figures appear human in outline, their forms vague and shadowed, lacking detail. They move along the walkway with measured pace, following its curve around the church. Their steps produce no sound. The wood beneath them does not creak or shift. They appear bound to the path itself, never stepping into the swamp or toward the interior. The figures do not interact with one another. They maintain distance, passing quietly without acknowledgement. Their movement feels deliberate and repetitive, as though repeating a route once walked countless times. When attention is focused directly on them, the figures often fade into the surrounding darkness. Looking away and back again may reveal them farther along the walkway, continuing their slow circuit around the building. Within the church, lantern light is frequently reported in the vestibules. Soft flickers appear near doorways and corners, glowing briefly before dimming again. The light sways gently, as though carried, yet no one is present. These lanterns do not illuminate the space fully. They cast small pools of warm light that reveal fragments of wall and floor before fading. The glow produces no heat and leaves no reflection on nearby surfaces. Moments later, the flicker may return in another vestibule, repeating the same gentle motion before disappearing again. The pattern creates the impression of someone passing through the church, pausing briefly in each space before moving on. Alongside these sights, visitors report a strong sensation of being watched. The feeling does not come from within the church, but from the swamp beyond its walls. The darkness between trees seems attentive, as if something unseen is observing every movement. The sensation intensifies near the outer walkway. Standing there at night often brings a tightening awareness, a sense that eyes are fixed from multiple directions. The swamp remains still, yet the feeling persists, unbroken by logic or reassurance. Some describe seeing subtle movement in the fog. Others notice reflections in the water that vanish when examined directly. No single source can be identified, yet the impression of observation remains constant. Historical records suggest the church was built to serve a small settlement that relied on the swamp for fishing and travel. The walkway allowed processions to circle the building during certain gatherings, lanterns guiding the path after sunset. Night services were once common here, conducted by lantern light when travel during the day was difficult. The swamp carried sound easily, and voices could be heard from far beyond the walls. Over time, the settlement declined, and the church was left behind. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects these old routines. The figures on the walkway echo ceremonial movement. The lanterns repeat paths once taken by hand. The swamp, ever present, watches as it always has. Visitors often describe the experience as deeply unsettling but controlled. The figures do not approach. The lanterns do not guide outward. The attention from the swamp feels passive, observant rather than aggressive. Sound behaves strangely here at night. Small noises seem to vanish, while distant splashes or rustling feel amplified. The church interior remains quiet. Even as the land beyond seems alive with subtle motion. Attempts to document the activity rarely succeed. Photographs capture fog and shadow. Video footage shows empty walkways and dark vestibules. Audio recordings pick up insects and water, but nothing distinct. Time perception often shifts during these visits. Minutes stretch longer than expected. Minutes stretch longer than expected. Silence feels heavier. Silence feels heavier. The repetition of movement and light creates a slow rhythm that draws focus inward. The repetition of movement and light creates a slow rhythm that draws focus inward. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Figures appear less often along the walkway. Figures appear less often along the walkway. Lantern light flickers briefly, then fades entirely. Lantern light flickers briefly, then fades entirely. The sense of being watched softens but does not fully disappear. The sense of being watched softens but does not fully disappear. By the hours before dawn, Dead Man's Hollow Church returns to near stillness. Fog thins. Fog thins. The swamp grows quieter. The swamp grows quieter. The walkway lies empty, and the vestibules remain dark. At sunrise, the church looks unchanged. Daylight reveals moss, stone, and weathered wood. No sign remains of figures or lanterns. Officials describe the church as structurally compromised and discourage visits due to unstable ground and wildlife. Those who have experienced Deadman's Hollow Church at night often carry lasting impressions. The image of figures circling the building. The quiet glow of lanterns in empty spaces. The persistent feeling of eyes watching from the swamp. The church does not feel hostile or welcoming. By day, it stands silent on its rise. By night, it resumes subtle motion, watched by dark water and fog. Until morning returns and the land settles once more into stillness. Hollow Oak Church rests at the edge of a small cemetery where the land rises gently before sinking back into low, mist-covered ground. The structure is modest, built of pale stone and dark wood, its walls weathered smooth by decades of rain and wind. What gives the church its presence is not its size, but what surrounds it. Their trunks are wide and deeply grooved, rising from the earth like pillars that predate the church itself. Branches stretch outward and interlock high above, forming a heavy canopy that blocks much of the sky. Their roots push through soil and stone, weaving among headstones and pathways, lifting the ground slowly over time. During the day, the cemetery feels hushed. Light filters through the leaves in broken patterns, drifting slowly across grave markers and moss-covered steps. The air smells of damp earth and aged bark. Even in daylight, sound feels muted here, as though absorbed by the trees before it can travel far. The church doors remain closed most days. Inside, the space is simple and restrained. Wooden pews face a small altar. The floorboards show signs of long use, worn smooth by generations of footsteps. Windows are narrow, allowing only thin bands of light to reach the interior. Fog is a constant presence around Hollow Oak Church. It gathers easily among the trees and settles low across the cemetery, especially in the early evening. As it thickens, distance becomes difficult to judge. Headstones fade into pale shapes. The church appears to float slightly apart from the ground, softened by drifting mist. As daylight fades, the atmosphere changes. Shadows stretch unnaturally among the oaks, growing longer and darker than the light should allow. They twist around trunks and roots, bending and curling along the ground. The movement feels slow and deliberate, not tied directly to the position of the sun. Visitors often notice the shadows first. A shape slides behind a tree, then reappears farther away. A dark form stretches across a headstone, then retracts. When watched directly, the shadows often seem still, blending back into ordinary darkness. As evening deepens, the fog thickens. It rolls between the trees and across the cemetery paths, brushing against the church walls. The boundary between trees, stones, and ground becomes less distinct. The world feels reduced to narrow pockets of visibility and sound. It is then that the hymns are heard. Faint and distant, they echo through the fog, carried softly between the oaks. The sound is low and gentle, more suggestion than song. The hymns do not come from inside the church. They drift from the cemetery itself, moving through the trees and across the graves. At times they seem closer, then farther away, as though the fog itself carries the sound along winding paths. Visitors describe the hymns as calm but unsettling. They are not loud or dramatic. They do not demand attention. Instead, they invite listening, drawing focus inward. The sound feels reflective, filled with quiet emotion rather than urgency. They twist and stretch in ways that do not match the shifting light. A shadow may slide along the base of a tree, then split into two shapes before merging again. A shadow may slide along the base of a tree, then split into two shapes before merging again. The movement feels coordinated, loosely following the rise and fall of the distant song. Despite the unusual sights and sounds, fear is rare. Most visitors report a sense of solemn stillness rather than panic. The cemetery feels occupied, but not threatened. The shadows do not rush or surround. The hymns do not grow louder or sharper. Researchers have suggested natural explanations. Fog can bend and carry sound across long distances. Wind passing through branches can create tonal patterns that resemble music. Low light can distort depth and movement, making shadows appear more fluid than they are. Yet these explanations struggle to account for the consistency. The hymns follow similar melodies each time. The shadows move most actively near the oldest oaks. The experiences repeat across seasons, regardless of weather. Some believe the land itself holds memory. That years of services, gatherings, and quiet mornings shaped the space. The church and cemetery may have absorbed traces of sound and movement, releasing them slowly when conditions align. Others believe the oaks play a central role. These trees stood here long before the church was built. They have witnessed generations pass beneath their branches. Those who linger often notice a change in perception. Time feels slower. Thoughts quiet. Attention narrows to sound, shadow, and breath. The hymns encourage stillness, as though inviting listeners to pause and reflect rather than move on. Inside the church, the sound is faint. The hymns press softly against the walls, never entering fully. Standing within the sanctuary creates a sense of separation, as though the sound belongs to the cemetery rather than the building. The shadows settle back into stillness, merging fully with the darkness beneath the trees. The fog remains, but feels less charged. By early morning, Hollow Oak Church returns to quiet. Sunlight filters through thinning mist. The oaks stand motionless. Shadows retreat into ordinary shapes. The cemetery appears unchanged, marked only by stone, grass, and roots. Yet those who leave often carry the memory with them. Not fear, but reflection. The sense that the place holds more than what can be seen. That sound and movement can linger long after their source has faded. Hollow Oak Church does not announce itself. It waits beneath towering trees, surrounded by fog and time. When conditions align, it reveals subtle motion and distant song, not as a warning, but as a reminder. Among twisting shadows and faint hymns, the church and its cemetery continue their quiet existence. Shaped by devotion, memory, and the slow passage of years beneath the sheltering oaks. The land here is low and saturated, and the ground gives way easily underfoot. Wooden walkways lead toward the church, raised just enough to stay above the waterline, though moisture clings to every surface. By day, the church looks worn but steady. Its dark wood siding is stained by humidity and age. The roof slopes unevenly, patched many times over the years. Steps lead up from the walkway to a narrow porch, their edges softened by rot and moss. The swamp water below reflects the building in broken fragments, never holding a clear image for long. Light fades quickly beneath the pines, and the water darkens into a smooth, reflective surface. Insects fall silent. The air grows heavy, thick with the scent of damp wood and decaying leaves. The church becomes the only solid shape in a landscape of shadow and reflection. It is in the water that the first signs appear. Ghostly shapes form on the surface of the swamp, drifting through reflections of trees and sky. These shapes move independently of ripples or current, sliding across the water with deliberate motion. They resemble human outlines stretched and distorted, pale against the dark surface. Pale against the dark surface. Looking up reveals nothing standing where the reflections suggest movement. Looking back down shows the shapes again, pacing slowly beneath the church porch and along the edges of the walkway. The water remains calm, untouched by wind or disturbance. As darkness deepens, figures begin to appear along the steps leading to the church. They emerge gradually, standing one by one along the worn wooden stairs. Their forms are faint and incomplete, as though assembled from shadow and reflected light. They do not climb or descend. They simply stand, facing outward toward the swamp, motionless and silent. These figures remain just within view, close enough to be seen but far enough to avoid detail. Their outlines blur at the edges, blending with the darkness behind them. When watched directly, they seem to thin. When attention drifts, they return with quiet consistency. Visitors approaching the steps often feel a subtle resistance, as if the air itself has thickened. Sound feels muted here. Footsteps soften. Breathing seems louder than it should. The church porch feels separated from the surrounding land, suspended between water and shadow. Then the whispers begin. They arrive softly, carried low and close, often just behind the listener. The whispers form names, spoken gently and without urgency. Each name is distinct, yet unfamiliar, as if belonging to people long removed from memory. The sound is never loud. It does not echo. It feels placed rather than carried. The whispers continue, arriving one at a time, each name spoken once before fading. Turning reveals no one nearby. The swamp water reflects only trees and darkness. Yet the whispers continue, arriving one at a time, each name spoken once before fading. Black Pine Church once served a small community scattered along the swamp's edge. Families traveled by foot and boat to gather here, crossing narrow paths and water routes. Records suggest generations passed through its doors, marking beginnings and endings in quiet ceremonies shaped by isolation and routine. The swamp remained, patient and unchanging, reflecting whatever stood above it. Some believe the whispers are echoes of those who once gathered here. Names remembered by the place even when no one remains to speak them aloud. The water reflects shapes not because they stand there now, but because they once did. As visitors linger near the steps, the whispers grow slightly more frequent. The names vary in tone and length, spoken with calm familiarity. None repeat in the same way. None demand response. The figures along the steps remain motionless, their presence steady and restrained. They do not react to sound or movement. They do not acknowledge the whispers. Despite the unsettling nature of the experience, panic rarely takes hold. The swamp, the church, and the figures feel bound by quiet rules. Those who step back toward the walkway notice the whispers soften. The names become less distinct, fading into the ambient sounds of water and wind. The figures remain on the steps, unchanged, watching the swamp rather than those who pass. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited results. Photographs capture distorted reflections and dark shapes that resist focus. Video footage shows movement on water without clear source. Audio recordings sometimes pick up faint, indistinct murmurs that cannot be isolated or translated. Environmental explanations suggest reflections, acoustics, and low visibility account for some experiences. These explanations describe parts of the scene, but not the pattern or specificity of the whispered names. As the night progresses, activity reaches a quiet peak. Reflections drift steadily across the swamp. Figures line the steps in even spacing. Whispers arrive at irregular intervals, each name spoken with the same soft clarity. Then, gradually, the process begins to slow. The whispers become less frequent, fading into silence. The figures thin and dissolve back into shadow, leaving the steps empty once more. The reflections on the water lose their shape, breaking apart into ordinary darkness. By the time night begins to lift, Black Pine Church stands alone again. The swamp reflects only trees and sky. No figures remain on the steps. No voices carry through the air. At dawn, the church appears unchanged. Sunlight filters through the pines. Water ripples gently. The walkway feels solid beneath foot. Nothing suggests the presence that filled the night. Those who leave after witnessing the darkness often carry a lingering impression of recognition. The names whispered remain vivid, even if unfamiliar. The shapes reflected in water feel deliberate rather than imagined. Figures appear briefly along the steps. Names long forgotten are spoken softly into the air, before silence returns and the place waits once more. Ghostlight Chapel stands at the edge of a quiet clearing where the ground slopes gently inward, drawing sound and shadow toward the small wooden structure. Trees surround the chapel on all sides, their branches arching overhead as if sheltering the building from the open sky. By day, the chapel appears simple and unassuming, its whitewashed walls dulled by time and weather. The interior is modest. The floorboards creak softly underfoot, and the air carries the faint scent of old wood and dust. Lantern hooks hang from the beams above, relics from an era before electricity reached this place. Even in daylight, the chapel feels hushed, as though sound itself is careful not to linger. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to shift. Light fades quickly within the sanctuary, retreating into corners and leaving long stretches of shadow between the pews. Outside, the clearing darkens, and the trees seem to press closer, their outlines blurring as mist begins to gather near the ground. Inside, the air cools, and the silence grows heavier, more intentional. It is after sunset that the lanterns appear. Soft points of light lift gently from the shadows and float across the sanctuary. They move slowly, hovering just above head height. Drifting between pews and along the central aisle. No hands hold them. No chains support them. The lanterns glow steadily, casting warm light that slides across the walls and floor without revealing any source. Visitors often freeze when they first see them, unsure whether to speak or move. They continue their calm passage, never colliding, never rushing, as if following paths long memorized. Their glow reveals details usually hidden, worn edges of pews, faint marks on the floor, and dust drifting quietly through the air. As the lanterns float, figures begin to appear near the altar. They stand silently on either side, upright and still, their forms pale against the darker wood behind them. The figures do not move or gesture. They face forward, toward the sanctuary, as though attending a gathering that never begins. Their presence feels complete, deliberate, as if they belong to the space rather than intruding upon it. Looking directly at the figures causes their outlines to soften, blurring slightly into the shadows. Looking away allows them to remain. They do not acknowledge visitors. They do not respond to movement or sound. They simply stand, holding their position near the altar without change. Within the deeper shadows of the chapel, pale faces sometimes emerge. They appear briefly along the walls, between pews, or near the ceiling beams, features faint but unmistakably human. The faces show no clear expression. They do not speak. They linger for only a moment before dissolving back into darkness, leaving behind a sense of quiet observation. The chapel feels aware, not of individuals, but of presence itself. Visitors describe the experience as deeply unsettling, yet restrained. There is no sudden movement. No raised voices. Everything unfolds slowly, giving time to observe, to feel, to notice how the space responds. Sound behaves strangely inside ghostlight chapel. Footsteps seem distant, even when taken nearby. Breathing feels louder than expected, echoing faintly in the open space. The lanterns move without sound, their light gliding smoothly over surfaces. At times, faint murmurs are heard, too soft to form words, as though the building is holding remnants of conversation without releasing them fully. Historical records of the chapel are limited. It was built to serve a small rural community that gradually dispersed over generations. Services became less frequent. Attendance dwindled. Eventually, the chapel closed without ceremony. No record marks its final gathering. It simply stopped being used, left standing as the clearing slowly reclaimed the land around it. Local belief suggests the chapel never truly emptied. According to long-held stories, routine remained even after people left. The figures near the altar mirror those who once stood there. Preserved within the walls. Minutes feel longer. Some feel compelled to remain quiet, as though sound might disrupt something already in motion. One visitor described standing midway down the aisle as lanterns drifted past overhead. Near the altar, two figures stood motionless, their presence calm and unwavering. Pale faces appeared briefly along the side walls, then vanished. The visitor felt no fear, only the sensation of standing within a moment that did not belong to the present. Another account tells of a pair who entered the chapel together at dusk. As darkness settled, lanterns floated into view, illuminating the sanctuary. Figures appeared by the altar. And faces emerged from the shadows near the ceiling. Both visitors felt watched, yet neither felt threatened. They left quietly. Guided more by instinct than alarm. The figures do not approach, and the lanterns do not force attention. Everything remains measured and calm, as if the chapel is content simply to be observed. As night deepens, the activity often lessens. Lanterns slow their movement, hovering in place before drifting back into shadow. The faces in the shadows appear less frequently, blending seamlessly into the darkness. By dawn, the chapel returns to stillness. Lanterns vanish without sound. The altar stands empty. Morning light filters through the narrow windows, revealing an interior unchanged by the night. Dust settles. Shadows resume their ordinary shapes. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. Its presence softened by age and quiet. Only those who have stood inside after dark remember the floating lanterns. The silent figures by the altar. And the pale faces watching from the shadows. The chapel does not announce itself as haunted. It does not seek attention or fear. It simply remembers, holding its quiet vigil within the clearing. Waiting for darkness to return so it can reveal, once more, the gentle glow and silent presence it has never forgotten. Ashwood Church rests at the edge of a quiet clearing where tall trees gather closely, their branches forming a natural boundary that filters sound and light. By day, the building appears dormant and reserved, its wooden exterior weathered but intact. Sunlight touches the steeple and faded doors, revealing a structure that feels preserved rather than abandoned. The path leading to the church is narrow and uneven, worn down by years of use long since ended. Grass grows between stones, and fallen leaves collect against the steps. The front doors remain closed but unlocked, opening into a sanctuary that feels carefully held in place by time. Inside, rows of wooden pews line the sanctuary, their surfaces smoothed by generations of hands. The floorboards beneath them are dark and polished from use, though dust now gathers in the corners. Light enters through tall windows, muted by age and clouded glass, casting soft patterns across the aisle. During daylight hours, Ashwood Church is completely silent. Sound seems to settle quickly here, absorbed by wood and space. Even footsteps feel restrained, as if the building resists disruption. The altar stands simple and unadorned at the front of the sanctuary. No decorations remain, yet the space feels deliberate, shaped for gathering and attention. Nothing moves. Nothing stirs. The stillness feels intentional, not empty. As evening approaches, the quality of light begins to change. The air cools, and the silence grows heavier, pressing inward rather than outward. The church seems to withdraw from the surrounding world. Night arrives gradually at Ashwood Church. Darkness settles first along the walls and beneath the pews, then fills the central aisle. Moonlight filters faintly through the windows, breaking the darkness into soft bands of pale gray. The sanctuary feels larger now, its boundaries less certain. It is after nightfall that movement begins. Shadows glide along the pews, detaching from the objects that should create them. These shadows do not flicker or scatter. They hold form and direction. Observers often notice them indirectly. A shift beside a pew. A shape passing where nothing should move. When attention turns directly toward them, the shadows slow or merge back into the darkness, becoming indistinguishable from the surrounding night. The shadows follow the structure of the sanctuary. They trace the length of the pews, pause at the ends of rows, then continue. Their movement feels familiar, as if repeating paths once walked countless times. They never cross the altar or move toward the doors. Alongside the shadows, sound returns to the church. Soft footsteps echo across the sanctuary, clear but restrained. The sound carries the rhythm of walking, measured and unhurried. Each step lands gently, followed by a brief echo that fades into silence. These footsteps move along the central aisle, then between the pews. The tone changes subtly depending on location, suggesting shifts in distance and surface. The sound never overlaps with visible movement, existing independently of any figure that can be seen. When a listener stops moving, the footsteps often continue briefly, then pause as well. Starting to walk again brings them back, maintaining distance without approaching. Turning to look reveals empty aisles and still pews. The footsteps do not rush or retreat. They follow a steady pace, as though part of a routine. The echo travels farther at night, lingering just long enough to register before dissolving into the building's quiet. Historical accounts describe Ashwood Church as an active center of its community. Services were held frequently, often in the evening. Congregants filled the pews, and footsteps echoed across the sanctuary long after sunset. The building was designed to carry sound clearly and evenly. Over time, the surrounding settlement declined. Attendance slowed, then stopped. The church was closed but not dismantled. Its interior remained intact, preserved by habit and respect rather than maintenance. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects these long years of use. Visitors often describe the experience as solemn rather than frightening. The shadows do not approach. The footsteps do not pursue. Everything unfolds with restraint, as if guided by an internal order that does not require explanation. Sound behaves differently within the church at night. Small noises fade quickly, while footsteps feel amplified despite their softness. The acoustics create a sense of proximity, making it difficult to judge distance or direction. Those who remain inside for extended periods report a subtle distortion of time. Minutes stretch longer than expected. Silence feels heavier between sounds. Photographs capture empty pews and dark aisles. Video footage shows only faint shifts in light. Audio recordings pick up wind outside and settling wood. But footsteps often remain just beyond clear detection. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Shadows glide less often, becoming slower and less distinct. Footsteps grow softer, spaced farther apart. The sanctuary begins to settle back into stillness. Moonlight softens, and the interior regains definition. The pews lie empty. The aisle stands clear and undisturbed. Daylight reveals worn wood and dust, but no sign of movement or sound from the night before. Officials describe Ashwood Church as structurally sound but historically inactive. There are no warnings posted about sounds or sightings, only notices encouraging respect for the building. Visitors are welcome during the day, though few choose to enter at night. Those who have experienced the church after dark often carry lingering impressions. The memory of shadows gliding along the pews. The echo of footsteps across an empty sanctuary. The sense that the building becomes active not with life, but with routine. Ashwood Church does not feel hostile or inviting. It feels attentive, shaped by repetition and memory. By day, it stands silent and composed. By night, it remembers how it was once filled with movement. When morning comes, the church settles again into quiet, holding its empty pews and open space. Waiting patiently for darkness to return and allow shadow and sound to move through once more. Widowmaker Chapel stands alone on a low rise of land where the surrounding terrain falls away into marsh and scattered trees. The structure is small and simple, built of stone blocks darkened by age and exposure. A short set of steps leads to the entrance, worn smooth by decades of careful use. From a distance, the chapel appears peaceful, almost ordinary, yet its isolation gives it a presence that feels heavier than its size suggests. The name comes from a long record of tragedy. Over many years, incidents occurred here under different circumstances. Accidents during repairs. Sudden illnesses during gatherings. Falls along the steps in poor weather. None of the events alone defined the place, but together they shaped its reputation. The chapel became associated not with a single loss, but with repeated sorrow that returned again and again. During the day, Widowmaker Chapel feels quiet and restrained. The air is still. Grass grows unevenly around the foundation. The stone walls hold a faint chill, even in sunlight. Birds rarely linger near the entrance, and sound carries farther than expected across the open ground. Inside, the chapel is modest. A few rows of wooden benches face a small altar. The floorboards are worn but intact. Light filters through narrow windows, creating pale shapes that move slowly across the walls. Nothing appears disturbed, yet the space feels attentive, as though holding its breath. The air cools quickly, carrying moisture and a faint echo of distant sound. It is after nightfall that the most unsettling activity occurs. Figures rise along the chapel steps, appearing gradually rather than arriving. They lift into view from the shadows near the base, becoming more defined as they stand upright. Human in outline but indistinct in detail, they remain silent and still for several moments. The figures do not climb in the usual way. They seem to emerge at different levels, as though the steps themselves release them. Once visible, they begin to move slowly upward, following the path toward the entrance. Their movement is deliberate. Each figure ascends at a steady pace, never rushing, never stopping abruptly. When they reach the top step, they pause briefly, then fade into darkness. No door opens. No sound accompanies their disappearance. Witnesses often describe the way the figures rise as unsettling. There is no sense of arrival or departure. The motion feels suspended between states, as though the figures belong neither fully to the ground nor to the building itself. Alongside the visual sightings come the sounds. Distant cries drift through the surrounding darkness, carried softly across the open land. The whispers intermingle with the cries. They are faint and fragmented, brushing the edges of hearing without forming words. The whispers rise briefly, then dissolve into silence. They do not feel close, yet they create the impression of presence just beyond sight. These sounds do not align directly with the figures. Cries may be heard when the steps are empty. Whispers may occur while figures stand motionless. The lack of clear connection adds to the sense of unease, as though multiple layers of activity exist independently. Temperature changes can create acoustic effects near stone structures. Yet these explanations do not fully account for the patterns reported. The figures appear only at night. They follow the same path along the steps. The cries and whispers occur under similar conditions, regardless of season or weather. Visitors often describe a deep emotional response. Not fear of immediate danger, but awareness of loss. The activity feels solemn rather than aggressive. The figures seem purposeful, not confused. The sounds feel expressive, not chaotic. Those who remain near the chapel at night report heightened sensitivity. Every small noise feels amplified. The open space around the building feels vast and isolating. Time seems to slow, measured by the appearance and fading of figures rather than minutes passing. Despite the chapel's reputation, no recent harm has been reported. No one has been touched. No one has been followed beyond the steps. The figures do not approach observers. The sounds do not escalate. Widowmaker Chapel allows observation without confrontation. Some believe the steps themselves are central to the phenomenon. They are the point of transition between ground and sanctuary. Years of careful ascent, hesitation, and gathering may have left an imprint. The repeated tragedies may have layered emotion into this narrow space. Others believe the chapel holds unresolved memory. That repeated loss without closure shaped how the place responds when darkness falls. The figures may represent moments paused rather than entities trapped. The cries and whispers may echo emotion rather than voices. As night deepens, the activity gradually fades. The figures rise less frequently, appearing only briefly before dissolving. The cries grow softer, carried farther away. The whispers thin into indistinct sound, then disappear entirely. By early morning, Widowmaker Chapel returns to stillness. Sunlight reveals empty steps and silent stone. The surrounding land appears unchanged. No trace of the night's activity remains. Yet those who leave often carry a lasting impression. Not terror, but weight. The sense that the chapel remembers what occurred within its reach. That repetition and sorrow shaped it as much as stone and mortar. Widowmaker Chapel does not announce itself. It does not warn or threaten. It stands quietly where it always has, exposed to sky and time. When night falls and sound travels differently, it reveals subtle movement and distant voices. Along the steps, figures rise and fade without sound. Across the darkened land, cries and whispers drift softly. And when daylight returns, the chapel releases its hold, standing silent once more, a small structure shaped by history, loss, and the quiet persistence of echoes that refuse to fully disappear. Misty Pines Church rests within a ring of tall pine trees whose trunks rise straight and close together, forming a natural boundary around the clearing. By day, the church appears modest and weathered, its wooden siding faded by years of exposure and its roof darkened by moisture. A narrow platform wraps around the entrance, raised slightly above the forest floor, its boards worn smooth by time. As evening approaches, the forest begins to change. Fog rolls in quietly between the pine trees, drifting low along the ground before rising to shoulder height. Fog rises to shoulder height. It moves with slow purpose, curling around roots and stones, then spreading outward until it reaches the church itself. The world beyond the clearing fades, leaving only pale trunks, shadowed branches, and the dim outline of the building. Sound softens as the fog thickens. The forest loses its depth. Footsteps become muted. Even the wind seems distant, whispering high in the canopy while the air at ground level remains still and heavy. The church platform becomes the focal point once night settles. Fog slides across the boards in thin layers, spilling over the edges and dissolving into the surrounding trees. Fog spills over the edges and dissolves into the surrounding trees. Lantern light is absent here, yet the platform remains faintly visible, as though the fog itself carries a dull glow. Lantern light is absent here, yet the platform remains faintly visible, as though the fog itself carries a dull glow. The doorway stands open, revealing only darkness inside. The doorway stands open, revealing only darkness inside. It is then that movement begins. Figures glide silently across the platform, emerging from the fog without warning. Their shapes are human in outline but indistinct, their edges blurred and softened by mist. They move smoothly, as if carried just above the boards. No boards creak beneath their passage. Visitors often sense something before fully seeing the figures. A light brush passes along an arm. Fingers graze the wrist or forearm with cool, fleeting contact. The sensation is unmistakable, precise enough to draw attention, yet gentle enough to avoid alarm. It does not feel like wind or fabric. It feels deliberate, placed with care. Turning reveals nothing nearby. The figures continue gliding at a distance, unchanged by reaction. The fog shifts lazily, reforming around their paths as if welcoming their movement. As visitors step onto the platform, the sensations repeat. A brief touch at the elbow. A cool brush against the shoulder. The contact never grips or pulls. It arrives and fades, leaving behind a lingering chill that takes a moment to disappear. The pine trees surrounding the clearing become pale silhouettes in the fog. Their trunks appear closer together than they did before, creating the sense that the space has narrowed. The church feels enclosed, sheltered from the outside world by mist and wood. Misty Pines Church once served a small forest community that gathered here through long seasons of isolation. Records describe quiet services held beneath towering trees, voices softened by timber walls and pine needles outside. Fog was common in this region, often rolling in during evening gatherings and lingering until morning. Some believe the figures reflect that lingering memory. Movement repeating without bodies. Paths traced again across a platform where people once gathered before entering the sanctuary. The touches feel like passing contact in narrow spaces, brief and familiar. As night deepens, the figures glide more frequently. They move in pairs or alone, never colliding, never interacting. Their paths seem practiced, repeating the same routes with quiet consistency. The sensation of unseen hands becomes slightly more noticeable. A brush along the back of a hand. A cool pass near the upper arm. Despite the unsettling nature of the experience, panic rarely sets in. The atmosphere does not feel hostile. The figures do not approach directly. The touches do not intensify. Everything occurs within quiet limits, controlled and measured. Those who stop moving notice an immediate change. The figures slow and thin into the fog, becoming harder to distinguish. The sensation of touch fades completely. The platform grows still, balanced, waiting. When movement resumes, the activity returns. Figures glide once more across the boards. Cool brushes pass again along exposed skin. The fog responds subtly, curling closer to motion before settling again. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited results. Photographs capture fog and empty platforms. Video footage shows drifting mist with occasional movement that resists clear definition. Audio recordings reveal only ambient forest sounds and the faint creak of aging wood. Environmental explanations suggest temperature changes, moisture, and low visibility contribute to unusual sensations. As the night reaches its quietest hours, activity begins to lessen. The figures glide more slowly, appearing farther apart. The sensation of unseen hands fades gradually, leaving only cool air and stillness. The fog begins to lift slightly, loosening its hold on the clearing. By early morning, Misty Pines Church appears unchanged. Sunlight filters through the trees, revealing an empty platform and silent doorway. Fog lingers in shallow pockets among the pines, but the figures are gone. No sensation follows movement. Visitors leaving at dawn often pause at the edge of the clearing, looking back at the church framed by tall trunks. In daylight, it seems peaceful and ordinary, offering no hint of what the night contained. Yet those who stood on the platform after dark remember clearly. Figures gliding silently across the boards. Unseen hands brushing lightly against them. The feeling of sharing space with something present but unseen. Misty Pines Church remains quiet and unmarked, surrounded by forest and time. By day, it offers solitude and shade. By night, when fog rolls through the pines and silence deepens, the church sometimes remembers its past. Figures glide once more across the platform. Unseen hands pass gently in the dark. And for a brief time, the clearing feels alive again. Before the fog thins, the movement fades, and the forest returns to stillness. Blackroot Church rests on the edge of a wide swamp where water and land blend without clear boundary. The structure stands on raised supports, lifting it just above the saturated ground, while dark roots twist through the soil beneath like veins. Cypress trees surround it on all sides, their trunks rising from shallow water and casting long reflections that shift constantly with the breeze. The swamp never fully settles. Water moves slowly between roots and reeds, carrying leaves and soft debris in quiet loops. The air smells of damp wood and earth, heavy and cool even under the sun. Sound travels poorly here. Voices fade quickly, and footsteps feel distant, as if absorbed by the ground before they can echo. Inside, the church is simple and narrow. Tall, thin windows allow in muted light that changes constantly as clouds pass and mist drifts outside. Lantern hooks hang from beams overhead, unused for years. During the day, the interior feels calm, though never fully bright. Shadows linger in corners long after sunlight should have reached them. When night falls, Blackroot Church changes completely. Moonlight filters through the windows and settles across the floor. And the floorboards appear black beneath its glow. What should reflect pale light instead absorbs it, turning the wood into a dark, almost liquid surface. The boundaries between boards blur, making depth difficult to judge. Visitors often pause at the doorway, unsettled by the way the floor seems to pull light downward. The air inside grows still, while outside the swamp wind begins to move. It slips through the trees and across the water, carrying sound in slow, uneven waves. The church creaks softly, responding to changes in temperature and moisture. Shadows stretch longer along the walls, pooling between pews and beneath benches where no light reaches. It is during these moments that figures are first seen. They emerge briefly along the aisle or near the front of the church, forming out of shadow just long enough to be noticed. Upright shapes appear where there was nothing moments before, their outlines faint and indistinct. They do not walk or gesture. They simply appear, remain still for a few seconds, then vanish as if pulled back into the dark. Looking directly at the figures causes them to fade more quickly. Seeing them at the edge of vision allows them to linger slightly longer. Visitors often describe a strange calm accompanying their appearance, a sense that the figures are not intruders but repetitions of something remembered. As night deepens, sound returns in a subtle and unsettling way. Faint chanting drifts through the church, carried on the swamp wind that slips through gaps in the walls and windows. The sound is low and layered, never forming clear words. It rises and falls gently, circling the structure rather than entering it directly. The chanting feels distant and close at the same time, as if the swamp itself is breathing sound into the space. Some visitors hear the chanting clearly. Others feel it more than hear it, a vibration that settles in the chest and lingers. The sound does not grow louder when acknowledged, nor does it fade when ignored. It remains steady, surrounding rather than guiding. The floor seems to respond as well. Under moonlight, the blackened boards appear to shift subtly, not moving, but deepening in tone. Standing still can create the illusion that the floor is uneven, angled slightly toward the aisle. Those who step carefully often feel steadier than those who rush, as if the church favors patience over urgency. Outside, the swamp grows quieter. Insects fall silent. Water movement slows. Mist thickens and presses against the church walls, curling around the supports beneath. The building feels isolated, suspended between water and sky, cut off from the rest of the land. Historical records of Blackroot Church are incomplete. It was built to serve a small swamp-side community that relied on fishing and timber. Over generations, flooding and isolation made life increasingly difficult. Families left gradually, not all at once. The church remained, its doors closing quietly when gatherings ceased. Local belief suggests the church never emptied. According long-held stories, routine remained even after people left. The chanting reflects old hymns carried outward rather than inward. The figures mirror moments of gathering, appearing where people once stood. The floor remembers footsteps, holding their shape beneath moonlight. Visitors who stay late into the night often report changes in perception. Time feels stretched. Minutes pass unnoticed beneath steady darkness and unchanging sound. The chanting becomes less distinct, not because it fades, but because it blends into awareness itself. Some feel compelled to remain silent, as though speech would interrupt something already in progress. One visitor described standing near the back pew as moonlight turned the floor completely black. Chanting drifted through the open windows, carried by the swamp wind. A figure appeared briefly near the altar, then vanished. The visitor felt no fear, only the sense of being present within a place that was listening. Another account tells of a small group who entered the church just before midnight. As the night settled, figures appeared along the aisle, fading in and out of view. Chanting circled the building, never entering fully. The group left quietly, without speaking, guided by instinct rather than alarm. Despite its unsettling reputation, Blackroot Church does not feel hostile. Nothing blocks the exit. Nothing advances. The figures do not pursue, and the chanting does not intensify. Everything unfolds slowly and deliberately, allowing visitors time to observe rather than react. The floor remains dark, but its pull feels weaker, as if the church is gradually releasing its hold. By dawn, Blackroot Church returns to stillness. Moonlight fades. The floorboards lighten, revealing their familiar worn grain. Chanting disappears with the night wind. No figures remain inside. Morning light filters through the windows, illuminating an interior unchanged by the hours of darkness. The church appears quiet and abandoned, its presence softened by age and swamp air. Only those who have stood inside under moonlight remember how the floor turned black, how figures emerged and vanished, how chanting rode the wind without source. Blackroot Church exists where water, wood, and memory intersect. When night falls and the swamp breathes sound into the air, the church responds. Floorboards darken. Figures rise briefly from shadow. Chanting drifts without words. It does not warn. It does not invite. It simply waits, holding its quiet vigil above the swamp, remembering every gathering, every step, every voice that once passed through its walls. And releasing those echoes slowly when the moon returns. Hollowbrook Chapel rests in a shallow valley where trees lean inward and soften the sound of the world beyond. A narrow creek runs alongside the building, following the natural curve of the land before slipping beneath small wooden bridges and continuing into the woods. By day, the chapel appears calm and modest, its stone walls weathered but standing firm beside the steady movement of water. The chapel was built with simplicity in mind. Its roof slopes gently, and its windows are tall and narrow, allowing light to enter without fully revealing the interior. The creek flows close enough that its sound carries through the open grounds, creating a constant backdrop that feels intentional. As though the building was placed to listen. During daylight hours, the setting feels peaceful. Sunlight filters through leaves and reflects off the water, scattering soft patterns across the chapel walls. The wooden bridges creak occasionally as the temperature shifts. A natural sound that blends easily with the creek's flow. Visitors often linger here, drawn by the quiet balance between structure and nature. The banks of the creek are lined with smooth stones and low grass worn down by years of water and foot traffic. Paths follow the water's edge, connecting the chapel to the surrounding grounds. Everything feels gently maintained, even in neglect, as though the land itself has taken over the role of caretaker. As evening approaches, the atmosphere begins to change. Shadows gather first along the creek, where the water darkens and reflects less of the sky. The sound of the current grows more noticeable as other daytime noises fade. The chapel's walls take on deeper tones, and the windows lose their clarity. Moonlight filters through the trees in broken lines, illuminating parts of the creek while leaving others completely black. The chapel stands quietly beside the water, its outline steady against the shifting darkness. It is along the creek banks that figures are most often reported. They appear as upright shapes moving slowly beside the water, following its path with deliberate pace. Their forms resemble people, but details remain indistinct, shaped more by motion than by features. The creek continues to flow smoothly, unbroken by ripples or splashes. When observers try to focus directly on the figures, they often fade into shadow or blend with the darker shapes of trees and stone. The movement feels purposeful. The figures trace familiar routes along the banks, pausing near bends in the creek or places where the water runs shallow. They do not look toward the chapel or acknowledge anyone nearby, remaining absorbed in their quiet paths. The wooden bridges crossing the creek become active in a different way after dark. Visitors hear footsteps crossing the planks, clear and measured, accompanied by the soft creak of aged wood responding to weight. The sound travels from one end of a bridge to the other, then stops. When the bridges are inspected, they are empty. No movement can be seen, and the creek below flows undisturbed. Moments later, footsteps may sound again on another bridge, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. These sounds occur even when the air is still. Leaves do not move. Wind does not shift. The rhythm of the footsteps matches a calm walking pace, too steady to be random noise. Those standing near the chapel often report a sense of being accompanied. The figures along the water and the footsteps on the bridges create the impression of quiet activity, continuing independently of observation. The space feels occupied by movement rather than presence. Historical accounts describe Hollowbrook Chapel as a gathering place for nearby settlements. The creek served as a guide through dense forest, and the bridges connected paths used during evening services and events. Lantern light once reflected off the water as people crossed back and forth after sunset. Nighttime gatherings were common, especially during seasons when daylight hours were short. The sound of footsteps on the bridges and along the creek would have been familiar and constant. Over time, as the settlements declined, those routines faded, leaving the structure and landscape unchanged. Some believe the nighttime activity reflects these long-repeated patterns. The figures along the creek echo walks once taken beside the water. The footsteps on the bridges repeat crossings made countless times. The chapel appears to remember movement rather than people. Visitors often describe the experience as restrained rather than frightening. The figures do not approach. The footsteps do not pursue. Everything unfolds with distance and repetition, as if governed by an internal rhythm that no longer requires participation. Reflections shift constantly on the water, and movement at the edge of vision becomes more noticeable. Attempts to document the activity rarely succeed. Photographs show empty banks and still bridges. Audio recordings capture water and ambient sound, but footsteps often register faintly or not at all. The experiences seem tied to being present rather than to proof. Spending extended time near Hollowbrook Chapel at night can feel disorienting. The steady sound of flowing water blurs the sense of time. Minutes stretch longer than expected, then seem to pass quickly. Leaving the area often feels abrupt. At certain moments, multiple bridges seem active at once. Footsteps echo from different directions, overlapping briefly before falling silent. The effect suggests coordination, as if several unseen individuals are moving through the valley simultaneously. As the night progresses, activity gradually diminishes. Figures along the creek appear less often. Footsteps become spaced farther apart. The chapel itself remains still, its walls absorbing shadow and sound. By the hours before dawn, Hollowbrook Chapel returns to near stillness. The creek continues its steady flow, unchanged and grounding. The valley feels emptied again. At first light, the chapel looks exactly as it did the day before. Officials describe Hollowbrook Chapel as a preserved historical site with minimal maintenance. There are no warnings posted about sounds or sightings, only guidance about slippery paths and fragile wood. Visitors are welcome during daylight hours. Those who have experienced the chapel at night often carry lingering impressions. The image of figures moving along the creek. The unmistakable sound of footsteps on empty bridges. The sense that the chapel and water continue their routines whether or not anyone is there to witness them. Hollowbrook Chapel does not feel abandoned in the usual sense. It feels ongoing, shaped by water, paths, and repetition. When darkness settles, movement returns briefly along the creek and across the bridges, not to disturb the living, but to continue patterns that were never fully brought to an end. Blood Willow Church stands at the edge of a low clearing where the land sinks gently into damp soil and shadow. The building is small and weathered, constructed of pale stone darkened by years of moisture. Around it, willow trees grow thick and close, their long branches draping downward as if shielding the church from the open sky. The willows dominate the grounds. Their trunks twist upward from the earth, wide and scarred, while roots crawl across the surface like exposed veins. Some roots push through old footpaths. Others wrap around tombstones in the adjoining graveyard, slowly tilting markers that once stood straight. Even when the air is still, the branches sway, moving in slow, uneven rhythms that do not match the wind. During the day, Blood Willow Church feels quiet but unsettled. Light filters through hanging leaves and broken fragments, never fully illuminating the ground. Shadows overlap and slide across the walls, changing shape as branches shift above. The air smells of wet bark, soil, and stone. Sound seems softened here, as though absorbed by leaves and earth before it can travel far. The cemetery surrounding the church is modest. Rows of worn headstones sit unevenly among the roots. Names and dates are etched shallowly, some nearly erased by time and moisture. The ground dips and rises unpredictably, shaped by years of erosion and the steady expansion of tree roots beneath the surface. As afternoon fades, the atmosphere begins to change. Light drains quickly beneath the willow canopy, while the sky beyond remains faintly visible. Shadows thicken around the bases of trees and between grave markers. The boundary between trunk, stone, and earth becomes less distinct, blending into a layered darkness that feels deeper than it should. It is among these roots and tombstones that figures appear. They crouch low to the ground, partially hidden by tangled wood and shadow. Their forms are human in outline but small and indistinct, darker than the surrounding darkness. They remain close to the earth, still and patient, as though rooted in place. When observed directly, the figures do not move. Yet when attention drifts, their positions seem to change. The movement is subtle and silent, never accompanied by the sound of shifting soil or leaves. Visitors often describe a sensation that accompanies the sight. A feeling of being watched from below, not threatening, but attentive. The awareness settles quietly, strongest near the oldest graves where roots are thickest and most exposed. It does not provoke panic, only alertness, as if the land itself is aware of those passing through. Night brings sound to Blood Willow Church. Whispers drift softly through the air, threading between branches and stones. They are low and indistinct, never forming clear words. Instead, they resemble fragments of conversation, overlapping and fading before meaning can fully emerge. Alongside the whispers comes faint laughter. It is light and brief, carrying a softness that contrasts with the heavy atmosphere. The sound never rises sharply or lingers long. It appears suddenly, then dissolves into silence, leaving behind a subtle sense of presence. Stepping away from the trees often causes the whispers to fade, only to return when moving back among the roots and tombstones. Despite the unusual activity, fear is uncommon. Most visitors describe curiosity mixed with unease rather than alarm. The figures do not approach. The sounds do not escalate. The church and cemetery feel occupied, but not hostile, as if something remains present without intent to intrude. Researchers have offered natural explanations. Willow branches brushing together can create sounds resembling voices. Wind moving through dense leaves may carry tones unpredictably. Small animals navigating the root systems can produce shifting shadows and subtle movement. Yet these explanations struggle to account for the consistency of reports. The figures appear only after dusk. The whispers and laughter follow similar patterns each night. The willows sway even when surrounding trees remain still. The experiences repeat regardless of season. Some believe the willows themselves hold memory. Their roots extend deep into soil shaped by years of human presence, grief, and gathering. Over time, impressions of quiet conversation, shared moments, and mourning may have settled into the environment. The crouching figures may reflect echoes of presence rather than distinct beings. Others believe the church plays a central role. For years, people gathered here to speak softly, to listen, to find comfort among others. Those habits of voice and movement may have shaped how sound and shadow behave within this space, continuing quietly after the building fell into disuse. Those who remain late into the night often report vivid dreams afterward. Dreams of standing beneath low branches. Of hearing voices without seeing faces. Of shared laughter that feels distant but familiar. Upon waking, many feel contemplative, as though the experience followed them into sleep. As dawn approaches, activity fades. The figures among the roots vanish with retreating darkness. The whispers dissolve into birdsong and the rustle of leaves. The laughter disappears completely. Morning light reveals only trees, stones, and damp ground. The willows continue their slow swaying, branches brushing one another softly. Roots remain exposed and unmoving. The church stands quietly among them, unchanged and watchful. Yet those who leave often carry a lingering impression. Not fear, but awareness. A sense that the grounds are not empty, even in silence. That presence does not always require form or voice. That memory can settle into land and grow alongside living roots. Blood Willow Church does not demand belief or explanation. It offers subtle movement, quiet sound, and the feeling of being observed without judgment. Beneath swaying branches and among tangled roots and stones, it remains a place where the boundary between absence and presence feels thin. In the soft whispers, the faint laughter, and the crouching shapes that fade with the night. The church and its grounds continue their quiet existence, holding what was left behind. And releasing it gently, one subtle moment at a time. Phantom Creek Church stands on a gentle rise beside a narrow waterway where the land dips and curves around an old burial ground. A short set of stone steps leads to the entrance, worn smooth by generations of use. Beyond the building, graves spread unevenly across the ground, their markers leaning at different angles beneath low trees and tall grass. As evening settles, the area grows noticeably still. The creek darkens first, reflecting only fragments of sky before losing its shine altogether. Sound softens near the water and among the graves, as if absorbed by soil and stone. The church stands quietly, its windows dark, its doors unmoving. When night fully arrives, the first change appears along the steps. Lantern light blooms softly, one glow at a time, outlining the path up to the church entrance. The lanterns hover just above the stone, casting warm pools of light that reveal texture and age without revealing any source. No chains hold them. No hands carry them. They simply remain, steady and calm, as though placed with careful intent. The effect is orderly, deliberate, and unsettling in its quiet precision. Beyond the church, movement begins among the graves. From the earth between headstones, shapes slowly rise. They emerge without sound or disturbance, assembling upward from darkness rather than breaking through soil. Their forms are upright and human in outline, though edges remain soft and incomplete in the low light. These figures do not wander far. They stand near where they rise, facing no clear direction. Some linger beside old markers. Others remain closer to the tree line or the creek's edge. They do not interact with one another. They simply exist, present and still. As the figures appear, shadows begin to behave differently across the grounds. Ordinary shadows stretch from lanterns, trees, and stones as expected. But others detach, sliding freely across grass and dirt without connection to any object. These independent shadows move slowly, tracing paths that do not align with light or landscape. Some shadows pass between graves, weaving carefully around markers. Others cross open ground where nothing stands to cast them. Their movement is smooth and intentional, as if following routes long memorized. Despite the activity, the atmosphere does not feel chaotic. The lanterns remain steady. The figures hold their positions. The shadows glide without haste. Everything unfolds with measured calm, as though governed by an unspoken order. Phantom Creek Church once served a small community whose lives were closely tied to the land and water. Gatherings took place here at dusk and dawn. Lanterns lit the steps during evening services. The surrounding graves grew over time, marking generations that passed through the church doors. As the community faded, the routines ended, but the place remained. Some believe the nightly phenomena reflect those long-established patterns. Lanterns lighting familiar steps. Figures rising where people once stood in remembrance. Shadows continuing movements without bodies to anchor them. The figures among the graves do not acknowledge attention. Standing still brings subtle changes. The figures seem to pause in their slow emergence. The independent shadows gather briefly near the edges of the burial ground before drifting apart again. The lanterns dim slightly, their glow softening but never disappearing. The church and graves feel balanced, waiting. When movement resumes, the activity continues. Shadows slide again across the landscape. The lanterns return to their steady warmth, outlining the steps with patient consistency. Attempts to document the phenomena have produced limited clarity. Photographs capture lantern light without visible source. And dark shapes among the graves that resist focus. Video footage shows shadows moving where no objects stand. Audio recordings reveal only distant water and night insects, unchanged by the visual activity. Environmental explanations suggest moisture, uneven terrain, and low light conditions may distort perception. These explanations address individual elements, but not their coordination or repetition. As the night deepens, the activity reaches a quiet peak. Figures stand fully formed among the graves, motionless and silent. Shadows move with greater confidence, crossing paths and circling the burial ground. Lanterns glow evenly along the steps, guiding no one in particular. The figures thin and dissolve back into darkness, sinking without trace into the ground from which they rose. Independent shadows lose cohesion, rejoining the shapes cast by trees and stones. The lanterns dim one by one, their light retreating until the steps return to shadow. By the time night begins to loosen its hold, Phantom Creek Church stands quiet once more. The graves rest undisturbed. Shadows behave normally. The creek flows softly beside the hill. At dawn, the church appears unchanged. Sunlight reveals weathered wood, worn steps, and silent markers. No lanterns remain. No footprints mark the ground. Nothing suggests the activity that filled the night. Those who leave after witnessing the darkness often describe a lingering sense of order rather than fear. The experience feels deliberate, as though the place followed routines it no longer needs explained. Phantom Creek Church remains open to wind, water, and time. By day, it offers quiet reflection. By night, it sometimes resumes a silent ritual shaped by light, form, and shadow. Lanterns may once again line the steps without source. Figures may rise quietly among the graves. Shadows may glide freely across the landscape. Not as a warning, and not as a threat, but as a reminder that some places remember how they were once used, and continue their patterns long after the voices have faded and the doors have closed. Darkwada Swamp Church stands on a low rise of ground surrounded by black water and tangled roots. Cypress trees crowd close on all sides, their trunks rising from the swamp like pillars, draped in long strands of moss that sway even when the air feels still. A narrow dirt path leads toward the churchyard, winding through shallow water and soft earth that shifts slightly underfoot. Long before the building comes into view, visitors often sense that they are being guided rather than simply walking. By day, the church looks worn but upright. Headstones scatter the surrounding yard in crooked rows, many half sunk into mud. The front steps are narrow and uneven, polished smooth by years of footsteps. The swamp presses in from every direction, quiet and patient, as if waiting. As evening approaches, Darkwada Swamp Church changes. Light fades quickly beneath the trees, and shadows deepen along the path and steps. Insects falling silent one by one. The air cools and thickens, carrying the scent of wet wood and still water. It is after sunset that the church reveals why it is known as the most haunted of all. Figures rise silently along the steps leading to the entrance. They emerge slowly from the shadows, pale shapes forming where darkness gathers most deeply. Some stand near the base of the steps. Others appear closer to the door. They do not climb or descend. They simply rise into view and remain still, facing the church as if waiting to be let inside. Looking directly at the figures causes their outlines to soften. Looking away allows them to remain. When attention shifts again, the figures vanish without movement, leaving the steps empty and unchanged. Inside the church, the atmosphere grows heavier. Wooden pews line the sanctuary, separated by a narrow aisle that leads toward a simple altar. Lantern hooks hang from beams overhead, and narrow windows admit only faint traces of outside light. The floor creaks softly beneath each step, the sound swallowed quickly by the thick air. Ghostly lanterns soon begin to float among the pews. They appear without warning, lifting gently from the shadows and drifting through the sanctuary. No hands hold them. No flames burn inside. The lanterns glow with a steady, pale light that illuminates the aisle and the edges of the pews, while leaving the corners in darkness. They move slowly, carefully, as if mindful of the space they pass through. Visitors often find themselves following the lanterns without realizing it, their steps aligning naturally with the soft glow ahead. The lanterns do not rush. They pause when visitors pause. They resume when movement continues, offering light without direction. Footsteps echo softly behind those walking the aisle, matching their pace with unsettling accuracy. When visitors stop, the footsteps continue for a moment, then fade. Whispers weave through the air, layered and indistinct, brushing past like breath rather than voice. At times, faint hymns rise among the whispers, slow and distant, carried on the swamp air that slips through gaps in the walls. The hymns never form clear words. They feel remembered rather than sung, echoes of melody without beginning or end. Some visitors describe the sound as comforting at first, then unsettling as it continues without pause. Outside, the swamp responds. Water shifts beneath the trees, ripples spreading without visible cause. The path through the churchyard feels subtly altered, curving more than before, guiding footsteps deeper among the headstones. Those who wander too far often report losing their sense of direction, finding themselves back at the church steps without remembering how they turned. Some say the swamp itself is alive. According to local belief, the water carries voices, holding sound and releasing it slowly. Roots beneath the surface shift and tighten, reshaping the ground just enough to guide movement. The church does not stand apart from the swamp. It is part of it, sharing memory and rhythm. Visitors who remain inside the church late into the night often experience a heightened awareness of presence. The figures outside rise again along the steps, visible through the windows as pale silhouettes. Inside, lanterns float steadily, and shadows stretch across the floor in patterns that move without light. One visitor described standing near the altar as a lantern drifted past at eye level. Footsteps followed behind him, stopping when he stopped. A faint hymn rose around him, neither welcoming nor threatening, simply present. Outside, figures lined the steps, unmoving. He felt no urge to run, only the sense that the church was aware of him. Another account tells of a pair who entered the churchyard just after midnight. The swamp seemed to guide their path, the ground firm where it should have been soft. As they approached the church, figures rose along the steps. And lanterns glowed inside. Whispers followed them through the yard, growing quieter only when they stood still. Despite its reputation, Darkwater Swamp Church does not feel aggressive. Nothing lunges. Nothing forces movement. The fear that arises comes from awareness rather than danger. Everything unfolds slowly, deliberately, giving visitors time to observe and choose their response. Those who remain calm often find the experience passes gently, like a tide moving in and out. Lanterns drift more slowly, then hover before dissolving into shadow. Figures along the steps thin and vanish one by one. Footsteps and whispers soften, blending into the natural sounds of water and wind. The faint hymns linger longest, fading gradually until only silence remains. Only silence remains. By dawn, Darkwater Swamp Church returns to stillness. Morning light filters weakly through the trees, revealing quiet pews and empty steps. The swamp resumes its subtle movement, water reflecting pale sky between roots. The path through the churchyard appears ordinary once more, its curves gentle and familiar. Visitors arriving during the day often sense nothing unusual. The church looks abandoned, fragile, and quiet, its presence softened by age and damp air. Only those who have stood there at night remember the rising figures, the floating lanterns, and the voices carried by the swamp. Darkwater Swamp Church exists where land and water share memory. When night falls, the swamp listens and responds. Figures rise silently along the steps. Sound follows footsteps without source. It does not call for fear. It does not demand belief. It simply remains, alive in quiet ways. Allowing the swamp to guide those who wander too close, then releasing them again when the light returns and the water grows still. Thank you, my dear friend, for walking with me tonight through the haunted swamp churches of Louisiana. These churches may seem quiet by day, but by night they are alive with shadows, whispers, and spirits that refuse to rest. If you ever wander through a swamp at night, and fog drifts low, or shadows move among the pews, or lanterns appear floating above the water, remember this. Not every shadow is harmless. Not every path is safe. And not every figure belongs to the world of the living. Walk carefully. Keep your lanterns close. And may the spirits of the swamp churches leave you to return safely to the world above. Until our next haunted journey, my dear friend.